Welcome to the World War I History Podcast, produced by the MacArthur Memorial. We invite you to follow us on Twitter at MacArthur1880 or find the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial on Facebook. This podcast was sponsored by the Ernst and Gertrude Tico Charitable Foundation. Between 1914 and 1917, communications technology and the way to secure or intercept this kind of traffic progressed dramatically. When the United States entered World War I in April 1917, it had to quickly catch up in these areas. Remarkably, the Americans made considerable progress by 1918. This progress and this success was partly due to Parker Hitt, an innovative Army officer who designed modifications for machine guns, but truly excelled at cryptology and at bridging the divide between civilian industry and the Army. To discuss the contributions of Parker Hitt, we are joined today by Betsy Rohaly Smoot, author of Parker Hitt, the Father of American Military Cryptology. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today.
Thank you, Amanda. I'm glad to be here.
So why don't you start us off with a biographical sketch of Parker Hitt and his early military service?
Parker Hitt is really a very interesting guy. He's born in Indianapolis, Indiana in 1878 to two very adventurous and free-thinking parents. And he is a good student. He gets straight A's in high school, and he goes to Purdue University, where he majors in engineering. And then in 1898, after the United States gets involved in the Spanish-American War, he quits after the end of his junior year and enlists in the Army. Now, he's enlisted because he was too young to be on. He was only 20 years old. He took the test to be an engineering officer and passed the test, but he was too young to get a commission. So he enlisted, and he was a volunteer engineer, and he went to Long Island to build a camp for the soldiers coming back from Cuba, and then was sent to Cuba to help build Camp Colombo. And after he was released from his service, he waited till he was 21. He took the commissioning exam, and he became an Army officer. So he never finished his college career, which is amazing because he was a very smart man. But I think he decided adventure was more interesting than school. And his first assignment was with the 22nd Infantry. He spent 2 tours in the Philippines with the 22nd Infantry, and he distinguished himself in several ways, recovering the body of a Navy seaman who had been captured by Filipinos and buried, well, what was left of the body. And he also distinguished himself during his second tour by helping raise the gunboats from Lake Lanao and running the gunboat service on the lake and basically helping wage war at sea, which was very interesting. He had injured himself during his first tour, and he was never quite right after that. So the gunboat thing was sort of a nice way he could work while being sick. And of course, the Army in that time had very different rules about being sick and being off duty. So the 22nd comes home from the Philippines. They go to California right before the San Francisco earthquake. So he's involved with a refugee camp. Then they get involved with the mining dispute in Goldfield, Nevada. And then they go off to Alaska. And he's really excited about Alaska. This is after he's been at the School of Musketry, done work with machine guns, developed all sorts of things. He's excited about Alaska, almost because it's going to be a break, I think. He had gotten so worn out at the School of Musketry in California. He needed a break. He took radio equipment with him. He got friendly with Signal Corps guys and learned a lot. He was in Nome. He was at Fort Davis, not Fort Davis. I guess it was Fort Davis in Nome. I'm sorry. It escapes me at the moment, but after the Alaska tour, they went to Texas, so from cold to hot, and participated in the maneuver division. He switched to the 10th Infantry because he wanted to go to the School of the Line. Instead, he got sent to the Signal School. And that's sort of his early career before he gets involved in cryptology.
So when does he get involved in cryptology then?
Well, he was probably familiar with the Army cipher disk, which was the main form of enciphering messages when he was in the Philippines. He had his turn as being intel officer for his company now and then. It was not really a serious part of his job. So he's probably familiar with the cipher disk. being a radio operator interested in radio, he knew about codes used on radio. He mentions using a code with his mother in telegrams. And codes and telegrams were mostly used to shorten the telegram and save money. And that he was kind of a frugal guy, so he was familiar with that. But he really doesn't get involved in cryptology, making and breaking codes and ciphers until he's at the signal school in the school year 1911. Signal school is at Fort Leavenworth, co-located with the School of the Line, which he never did get to go to. But he got to meet a lot of people there, and he learned, well, he probably knew a lot more about signaling than the others because he really didn't have to study much, his wife said. She couldn't believe that he just went to classes and then he didn't study at night, and all the other officers are studying at night. I think this is in the days where the men are expected to repeat back exactly what they've learned out of the book. And so they're trying to memorize texts. And he and another student read an article about cryptology and present it to the class. And it sets him off to try to devise a cipher device. And he devises a cylinder cipher device, and he devises a strip cipher device that use common principles. And he starts really getting interested in code and ciphers, but he's also still interested in plain old signaling. He develops a telephone switchboard. His thesis for the year is on dry cell batteries. So he's got very broad interests, but he's becoming really interested in code and cipher, and he's really good at it. And he stays on at the school as an instructor, and this is when he starts to get a lot of things from Washington to decode. And an officer named Samuel Reber was sending him things from Washington, Mexican messages, other messages, as little tests to see how good he was at decoding and decrypting. And he's really good at that, and he calls him a shark on ciphers. So he gains a reputation for being somebody in the Army who knows how to do this.
So in 1914, you have World War I starting. Which country at war at that time had the most expertise in cryptology? And by 1917, how have those capabilities evolved in Europe?
At the outbreak of war, France and Austria-Hungary were the two countries that had an ongoing cryptologic effort. They had not taken a break in cryptology. They were ready to go, and they were the best in Europe. Britain had a long history of doing codes and ciphers, but had stopped their service in the mid 1800s, and they pick back up when the war begins, of course. So very quickly, Britain and Germany become experts at this as well, but the French and the Austro-Hungarians are really leading the way. The other nations do get involved. The Russians work with the French, actually, and do some work on this. The Italians, but France and Austria-Hungary lead the way. And by 1917, the French and the British of the Allies, of course, are on equal footing with different strengths and different areas of responsibility. So things are getting good, but the United States is a little bit behind.
So you mentioned the United States being behind. Can you describe America's cryptologic capabilities in 1917 when it enters the war?
Yeah. Now, there had been code making going on all through time. The State Department had codes, the Navy had codes, the War Department had codes constructed by the Signal Corps. So there's familiarity with using codes, but intercepting radio is still a fairly new technology. Intercepting radio messages, intercepting, telegraphic messages by other means is happening. And there is no centralized effort to break these messages or to collect these messages. In terms of radio collection, the Army and the Navy both had radio stations used for communication with each other, and in their spare time, they'd intercept messages and collect them and write them down and send them off. But the Army really only had three, maybe four people, three Army officers and Parker Hitt's wife. Parker Hitt, Joseph Maubourne, who would later be Chief Signal Officer, and Frank Moorman, who would run the effort in France for the AEF. They were the three guys. And when the punitive expedition took place and the radio tractors in Mexico were collecting signals, they'd collect the messages and they'd have to mail them off to these guys. They're basically secret messages being sent in the mail. I guess they get collected, they go to Washington, they get mailed off or sent via telegraph to these three guys, and they break them out, and not necessarily in a timely fashion. So it's not really an intelligence operation. It's the Army doing the best it can at the time. So the capabilities are pretty bad. And as I'm sure most of our listeners know, Ralph Van Diemen, the father of American military intelligence, is trying to coordinate a broader Army intelligence system in 1917. And he's aware that he needs cryptology as part of that.
Let's take a break. We'll be right back in a moment.
Hey, Changemakers, this is Lynn Weinman, host of the Agency for Change podcast. If you are ready to be inspired by stories of people and organizations making a real difference, then you are in the right place. Listen and subscribe now to the Agency for Change podcast and join us as we explore how a spark of passion can ignite a world of change. Let's amplify good together.
So Parker Hitt is clearly recognized at this time as an expert in this area. The big question, though, after April 1917 seems to be, where will he serve during the war? Military Intelligence Division wants him. American Expeditionary Forces Commander General John Day Pershing wants Hitt. How does this struggle play out, and where does he end up?
Well, this is interesting because after the school, Hitt goes to Fort Sill with the new School of Musketry, and he's an instructor there, and he spends some time on the Texas border where he's decoding things. And he's back at Fort Sill, and he's breaking messages and doing things. And Van Diemen starts telegraphing him, because his work has gone to Van Diemen. I don't think he had ever met Van Diemen at this point. And Van Diemen's like, I'm going to send you orders. You're going to be ordered to Washington. Now that war is broken out, you're coming to Washington. You're going to work for us in a cryptologic capability, but it's not all set yet. So be ready. And at the same time, now General Edgar Russell, had been the director of the Army Signal School. Well, Hitt was there and then moved on to Washington. And then he was in Texas with Pershing at the time war is declared. And Russell is a real fan of Hitt's and a mentor to Hitt. And so Russell is plotting at the same time. He comes to Washington with Pershing and he sends a telegram and he gets his orders in a little bit faster than Van Diemen. But Hitt receives two sets of orders on the same day from Fort Sill to report to Washington, and he's not really sure what's going to happen. Van Diemen had wanted him to stop along the way at a facility called Riverbank Laboratories in Geneva, Illinois. And I guess I should have mentioned that in 1917, another center of cryptology in the U.S. was this private think tank organization called Riverbank Laboratories, which was run by an eccentric millionaire, hiring people who were doing codes and ciphers. The man who ran this was convinced of a philosophy that was common in the early 20th centuries, that there was a code in the first folio edition of Shakespeare that would prove that Francis Bacon was the author of Shakespeare, and you could break out the code and get messages. And he hired a bunch of people to look at this and look for the cipher, look for the code. And one of those people was William Friedman, and then William Friedman's soon-to-be wife, Elizabeth Smith, were hired to do this. So there's a cryptologic center that are learning from Parker Hitt's book, The Manual for the Solution of Military Ciphers. And Van Diemen wants Hitt en route to Washington to stop at Riverbank and talk to them and get them up to speed, because Van Diemen knows they're going to need Riverbank. So a little diversion. Hitt gets to Washington and he checks in with Russell first. And I'm going to read a little bit from the book about that. And Hitt writes about this day to his wife. His wife is back at Fort Sill getting ready to pack up and move to her family home in San Antonio, Texas. He checked in with Russell at the War Department. On Tuesday, May 22nd, Hitt and Russell visited Van Diemen at the War College, which was at Washington Barracks, which is now Fort McNair. And they're basically going to tell Van Diemen that Hitt's going with Russell. Hitt told his wife, Van Diemen, was furious and not even civil, and he dismissed Hitt and Russell and made an urgent telephone to the Adjutant General's office to launch a vigorous protest about Pershing stealing Hitt. Meanwhile, Russell and Hitt beat it back across town to the War Department, and Russell rushed in to see Pershing while Hitt's waiting outside in the hall for him. And Pershing reportedly said, according to Hitt, "God damn the general staff, my staff goes with me," and then stormed out of the office looking for General Tasker Bliss, who was the acting Army Chief of Staff. So you can just imagine that dramatic moment. I don't think Hitt and Pershing knew each other at the time, but Hitt knew Russell and Russell knew Pershing, and Pershing wanted Russell to have Hitt, and Russell wanted Hitt as his executive officer to go to France. And so that happened. So that's May 22nd, and I think it's then May 28th. They go to, and they depart on the Baltic. So Hitt goes on the Baltic with Pershing to France, and Van Diemen is left fuming, though Van Diemen later admits to Hitt's wife, Genevieve, who had also been breaking codes for him, that we all understand. Everybody wants to be in France where the action is, but he's a little bit sore still that Pershing has stolen the best code and cipher expert off of him. But Hitt would have been really unhappy in Washington when all the action was in France.
In your book, too, you do emphasize that he always wanted to be seen as an infantry officer, right?
Yeah, he was an infantry officer. He chose to go infantry, not engineering. Mm-hmm. He chose to stay in the infantry, even though his father had been doing some his father was well connected politically and thought if he moved to the artillery, he would get promoted more quickly. But he was an infantryman. That's what he knew, what he liked. And he wasn't going to sit behind a desk in Washington when there was a war going on.
So. Wow. Okay. So tell us about his service overseas then. What were his main duties and what are some of his key achievements during the war?
So Hitt's there a long time. He goes with the first troops on the Baltic, and he does not come home until July 1919. So he has 4 basic jobs during that period. At first, he's going as Russell's exec. Now, Russell is the chief signal officer for the AEF. So he's in charge of all the signaling, and that's what Hitt does. He helps organize the signal plan, figure out where the telephone wires are going to go from the port in Brest all the way to where the AEF is going to be assigned, investigates what kind of equipment they need, puts in orders for equipment, goes to see the French facilities and what they're doing, including when the French were doing frontline listening posts. So he getting familiar with signal collection on the front line, investigating British methods, helping set up even the installation of the phones at AEF headquarters when it goes into Chaumont and the buildings, just getting all of that. And we'll talk a little bit about the Hello Girls later, I think, but it was at this time in Paris, before they moved to Chaumont, that Hitt reinstates an idea he had had several years earlier while at the signal school, that we need female telephone operators over here to help out. Now, when the Signal Corps and the AEF Signal Corps moves away from Chaumont to their own headquarters, Hitt stays behind at Chaumont. And it's sort of to be Russell's eyes and ears at what's happening back at headquarters and report back to him. But it's also, he's been seconded to the G3 because the G3 realized they don't have anybody who really knows about communications and stuff, and they need him to help with planning. So he shares an office with Hugh Drum for a while, and he is in Chaumont while the cryptologic efforts are getting started, and he's helping Frank Moorman, who's the head of the G2A6, come up with, how are we going to log this? How are we going to do this effort? How are we going to set it up? He's helping Robert Lowry, who's the head of the radio section, who's going to control the collection operations, devise a plan. He's helping Howard Barnes, who's the head of the code compilation section, with what codes are we going to develop? How is that going to work? So he's sort of the glue that ties those 3 efforts, which are not, the radio section and the code compilation section are both Signal Corps operations, but the G2A6, of course, is part of the G2, the intelligence operation. So they're not subordinate to each other and they don't belong together, but he's sort of making them a 3-part team. And then in late July 1918, he's appointed Chief Signal Officer of the First Army. several other jobs had been talked about and dangled for him. Now, Hitt's not a Signal Corps guy. He's been to the Signal School, but he's infantry. And he had hoped to be Russell's deputy, but that went to George Gibbs, who was a Signal Corps officer, and a good friend of Hitt's. But Hitt is put in charge of the Signal Corps for the First Army, so he immediately has to start gathering his supplies, making his plan, getting lines, and a lot of that was negotiating with the French to try to get circuits to support the operation at Saint Mihiel. So he's very involved with that, but he's also involved with making sure that units have the right coding materials, that they aren't making up their own call words and things like that, and trying to make sure people aren't overusing the telephone, that they're sending telegrams when they can, because the telephone system gets overburdened. In battle, he would deny people would want more telephone lines, and he would insist they use the radio instead, even though he wasn't a big fan of using the radio because he felt it was fairly insecure. So he's very busy, and he's the one at this point who gets the Hello Girls integrated into the First Army. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. And gets ready, and then he's sitting back at headquarters as the battle for Saint Mihiel goes ahead, waiting for the communications to happen, which never do, because everything is very silent, and he learns a lot about the flow of battlefield communications from that experience. Now, the G2A6 subordinates a group to the First Army, so the First Army gets a G2A6, but these people are also working with Hitt. And then the radio section subordinates their collectors to the First Army, and Hitt is sort of in charge of those people who are doing the field collection as well. So he has a lot of duties, which we now think of as cryptologic, which he would have thought of as just Signal Corps work. Nothing special, but it's the kind of stuff that, in the military, the cryptologic folks would be doing today, not the Signal Corps. So he's got a very busy war, of course, because then when they move to Suez after Saint Mihiel, getting ready for the Meuse Argonne, he has to set up the organization there and do the same thing. He gets involved with radio deception plans. He has a very, very busy war. Once the First Army is wound up after the armistice, he is put on various boards, inter-allied boards for communications, radio telegraphy, things like that, that are involved with the peace negotiations. He's doing little errands for Russell all over the place, and he is put on Pershing's Superior Board as the Signal Corps officer. He's one of only two men who are not general officers who are on Pershing's Superior Board. And of course, Pershing doesn't like their report, and it doesn't really get incorporated into our doctrine at the time. But it was an important job, and it was an honor for Hitt. But he's doing this, and he's running back and forth between Germany and France and all and around and about. And then he gets put in charge of the Third Army Signal Corps operations because somebody's gone home sick. So he has to stay on and do that and help with planning, because they all realize that until everything's signed, they might be at war at any time. So making comms plans for what to do if they have to advance at that point. Finally, he gets to go home. I think he was happy, finally. I mean, he was glad to be in France, but his wife Genevieve, who has her own code and cipher expertise and is doing work for the Southern Department's intelligence office during the war, is really glad he's coming home, because so many people who went later than Hitt came home earlier, and she's sort of feeling isolated and upset that he's, missing out on home life.
He has a very, very busy war, that's for sure. So you mentioned it a few times, but tell us about his connection to the Hello Girls.
When Hitt was at the Signal School talking about the next, they suppose they would be in World War I, the things they would need that did come to fruition. They would need to enlist, recruit, commission men from telephone companies to do the telephone work. And indeed, many of the signal battalions were made of men from the Bell system and other communication, phone and telegraph systems. And he talked about needing the telephone operators as well, probably female telephone operators who knew what they were doing. When they first got to France, I think Russell and Hitt and everybody was really fed up with the French telephone operators not being able to deliver And I don't know whether it was a work ethic thing or a language thing, but they were just not happy with the way communications were running using French operators. And so Hitt and a colleague of his and Russell got their heads together. Hitt wrote a proposal that went back to Washington, and that is what got the concept of hiring women telephone operators, what became known as the Hello Girls, into the AEF. So Hitt isn't really in charge of them when they come over. They're looked after by a woman named Julia Russell, no relation to General Russell. But he's aware of them. He goes to parties at their operator house in Chaumont. He's familiar with their operations. And he knows when he becomes signal officer of the First Army, he wants a core of those operators with him at headquarters. And he gets to know Grace Banker, the head operator, and they pick out 6 women to join him at First Army headquarters. And he wants them on the overnight shift because he figures that's going to be the busiest shift and the male telephone operators can't handle it. Turns out to be a dead time in the end, but everybody's really pleased with them. And there's a little story, I can't remember where it comes from now, but that after the Battle of Saint-Mihiel, Hitt was walking with Pershing down the street, and they encountered some of the operators across the street, and they went over and speak to them, and Pershing were just like, how do you feel about the job now? And they're very glad to serve. And Pershing tells Hitt, well, take them where they want to go. And Hitt, of course, had already planned to. He had sent them orders. There's a very nice letter that Grace Banker's granddaughter shared with me that was written about how to get ready, get your gas mask, kiss your cushy life at Chaumont goodbye, and you're coming to First Army. And when they moved to SWE, the operators' quarters are actually co-located in one big building where Hitt's office is at one end and the operators' quarters are at the other, and their telephone operations center is in the middle, and there's a big dining room, and it's a very collegial, he's sort of the father of the family, looking out for the women there and making sure they don't get in any trouble. There's changes to the quarters after that and lots of things, but he was very fond of them. He was respectful of their abilities. He had a very, his wife Genevieve was very, I guess in the 60s, they would have called Genevieve a liberated woman. She was very modern and willing to do work, and he had a high respect for women who were doing that kind of work. His mother was a big committee woman, preferred working on committees, and so he respected women who did non-traditional work and looked out for them, and generally, maintained really good relations even after the war. He was in contact with Grace Banker and Suzanne Prevost and some of the others who remembered their wartime service fondly and admired his command ability. Yeah.
Very interesting. So World War I marks the first purposeful, organized effort by the U.S. military to collect and analyze communications. And yet the cryptologic successes of World War I don't make the U.S. cryptologic community a permanent part of the military right after that war. Why do you think that was?
Yeah, there's really no need or no perceived need for that kind of operation. We're not at war. Militaries are starting to use radios, but they're not the kind of radios you're going to intercept from the United States. So there's not a target. There's a diplomatic target, and that's handled by the State Department and the War Department, setting up what is known as the American Black Chamber, Herbert O. Yardley's little group in New York, which is reading diplomatic cable traffic, mostly cables that are handed over by the cable company to the government rather than intercepted. Different kind of law, different. So there's that kind of cryptology going on in New York. The Navy in 1924 sets up its own code and cipher breaking organization and is starting to delve into that. And the Army is not really getting it. The Army has a decade-long debate about how we should do this. Should it be with the Signal Corps? Should it be with the intelligence people in the G2? Because the Signal Corps, of course, is investigating radio all the time and collecting things and trying to figure things out and making codes, but they have no real mission to intercept and do analysis. If they collect something, they'll send it to the intelligence people, but the intelligence people don't really have a separate cryptologic organization. The Signal Corps has William Friedman in Washington, making codes mostly, breaking a few things on and off. But it's not till 1930 when there's the almost simultaneous closure of the Black Chamber in Washington and the opening of the Signal Intelligence Service in Washington, New York and Washington, and putting William Friedman in charge, where we start to have an Army cryptologic organization that then joins what the Navy has been doing since the mid 1920s. And of course, the Japanese threat at that time and the run up to World War II is happening, and that sort of concentrates the mind in the cryptology. And it helps that Friedman had been a junior officer in World War I who was stationed in Chaumont and who was familiar with how things were run in World War I to sort of make that happen in the Army. The Navy is a little bit different case, but the Army is what I'm most familiar with. So it really, why have an operation when there's nothing to do? And other powers had more of a, like the Brits particularly, have continuous cryptologic effort from World War I on, but they were closer to the continent and had other interests.
Any final thoughts?
Well, what really struck me most, it's really between working on Parker Hitt and simultaneously working on a larger work about cryptologists in World War One, which came out last year. It's just illuminating to see the talents and depths of the U.S. cryptologic force at the time. They took people from so many different walks of life. Hitt, he was supposed to be an engineer. He probably would have been a fine engineer. I think in modern life, he probably would have been a computer guy. He would have been on the early fringe of the computer industry and getting involved in that. He was a tinkerer and an innovator and liked to build things. You see that, but you see so many people with PhDs in literature and classical studies and languages coming in to do this work. And they have no exposure to codes and ciphers, but they quickly build up an expertise and an understanding of how the work should be done and organize things in ways that really held true throughout World War II and then into the Cold War. Any person who did similar work during the 60s, 70s, 80s could look at this material that was done in World War I and recognize what they were doing and maybe even recognize the format of how they were doing things. Parker Hitt, to me, he dismissed his cryptologic work. It was sort of a hobby. He carried on later in life with doing various things, but he wrote the manual for the solution of military ciphers, which everybody used. It was really the first comprehensive manual in English, in American English at least, to discuss this. But it wasn't, it was his hobby. It was an avocation, not a vocation. But he was responsible for advising and consulting and helping grow the broader cryptologic effort. World War I is really the peak of his military career. He had a really interesting career and a really interesting life. And it makes me wonder how many other interesting officers out there that no one's really investigated and looked into and said, well, these are really extraordinary people that the Army, the very small Army pre-World War I, is hiring and studying. Where did they come from and what did they do and what did they go on to do?
I agree. I think that pre-war, very tiny Army had some very interesting people in it for sure. I'd love to read that book someday.
Yeah, well, I sort of touch on it in my recent book, From the Ground Up, American Military Cryptology During World War I. I could not go into the people as much as I wanted, but I wrote quite a few profiles of people, and I've got a website up where I'm trying to get all the names, and I think we know maybe 85% of the names of people who did cryptology. There were over 1,000 people working in that field, and I'm trying to get biographical profiles written of most of them because they're writers, they're artists, they're jewelry makers, they're classicists, they're professors. Stephen Vincent Benet, they're poets. They're all sorts of people who are part of this effort, and they have really interesting lives, and they're plain old telegraphers from industry. And, it's really an extraordinary generation of people who came together to do this work. So I'm hoping to continue on with that as time permits. So,
we'll share the website link in the episode description. So I think our listeners would be very interested to learn about more of those people.
Say, please be patient with it because I've been a little bit behind in getting things up there, but slowly but surely.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. Real interesting learning about Parker Hitt, someone I think we all need to know a little bit more about, and just interesting learning about the cryptology in World War I.
Thank you, Amanda. I really enjoyed talking with you this morning.
Thank you for listening. If you have questions, suggestions, or comments, we want to hear from you. You can find us on Twitter at MacArthur1880, on Facebook as the General Douglas MacArthur Memorial, or you can email MacArthurMemorial@norfolk.gov.